The Phantom of the Opera is by far my favorite movie monster, over titans like Dracula, Mummy, and the Wolfman. The 1925 classic just isn't like the others, his definitive portrayal reaching back to the silent era. Weirdly, only the remake gets included in the Universal Classic Monster box sets, although it's clear from how the Universal Studios parks treat him that they know that Lon Chaney's 1925 version is the greatest of all time. Most Gothic horror revolves around something eldritch that defies our everyday experience. An ancient curse, a pre-human beast, a mystery from an older, barbarian culture, or at least the transgression of natural laws by the misuse of science or demonology. The Phantom is not a literal monster, and he has no superpowers. He's just a very ugly psychopath who knows his way around a building. Yet, he holds his own in the monster pantheon, and like the others, has weathered countless remakes, only rivaled, as the most popular monsters are, by one major twist on the story many decades later. I've got some thoughts on why. Now, do I need to rehash the story? The Paris Opera House is haunted by a phantom who insists on having his own private box, and he issues orders about who gets on stage to sing. If you disobey or get too nosy, you'll end up dead. Most famously once by having a massive auditorium chandelier dropped onto the audience. Christine, a young soprano, gets trained to sing by this shady, angelic figure, only to be seduced into his creepy underground lair and discover that his weird mask hides a really, really ugly maniacal guy named Eric. She takes refuge in the arms of her childhood sweetheart, a nobleman named Raoul. Eventually, the Phantom captures them both, but releases Christine when she promises to marry him. And then the Phantom dies. It's very Hades and Persephone, and the infernal imagery never stops. Eric insists that Christine take the female lead in Gounod's Faust, playing the girl seduced by the devil's own master. He wants to produce his opera, Don Juan Triumphant, presumably correcting Mozart's ending, which sends Don Giovanni to hell at the end. In the movie's vast backstage, we see a Hieronymus Bosch-like Hell's Mouth, and Eric's idea of a torture chamber is this hall of mirrors where you can turn the heat up to rival the Sahara. That last bit, it's a little bit weird. No big surprise that every version except the 1925 classic and an odd 80s cartoon has axed that scene. But for all that, Eric is not Faust or Don Juan. He's just a mistreated genius, and it's easy to see how any lonely young dude could latch onto his story. Eric's born into the friend zone, his enormous talents ignored or shunned by mainstream society. He offers the girl of his dreams his very life, only to see her whisked away by some rich jock. Much of Gothic horror follows these tropes. Dressed up in cool costumes, mysterious lairs, and exotic culture, you have the perfect escapism for lovelorn dreamers. The sympathetic audience member bristles when Raoul, the ingenue's irritatingly perfect lover, assumes that she would never see the monster as a conceivable mate. As Raoul rails at the Phantom in the musical version,
I make a lie to you to save me.
the nerve of that guy. For the story to work, Eric's fate has to be sealed from the day of his birth. There's this trend, started with the weak remake I mentioned before with Claude Rains, where the Phantom's face gets splashed with acid or stuck in a record press or whatever. Seeing him come by his disfiguration may be horrifying for us, but it robs the Phantom of his depth. He wasn't deformed mid-life like Two-Face and suddenly just became evil. No, Eric has to roam the earth to find somewhere his talents would be appreciated and his ugliness ignored. He learns architecture and haunted house tricks in Asia, and then flees back to France, followed by this Persian police detective who knows Eric's secrets and methods. And finally, he settles in Paris and builds the Opera Garnier around himself. He fills it with secret passages and an underground lair, isolated in the middle of this black subterranean lake. Tucked inside this stinky dungeon are a swanky conservatory, a couple lavish bedrooms, and enough explosives to blow the whole block sky high. That is not a coincidence. This is the culmination of a lonely, weird Gothic life. The opera is Eric's lair, it's his cocoon, his tomb, and his tombstone. It's his mouthpiece for Faust and Don Juan Triumphant. Writing his Gothic mystery novel back in 1910, Gaston Leroux made the monster and his lair one. Universal, making this silent version, knew this, and decades later when the musical took the world by storm, Andrew Lloyd Webber also knew this. So like Goonies and Star Wars, the Phantom of the Opera is built around the geography of a very specific contained location. But unlike those movies, this place is real, and you can visit it. When I was a teenager, I made a beeline for the Opera Garnier on my very first trip to Paris. It did not disappoint. The building is just lathered over with gilded statues and oh so meaningful frescoes. The bulk of the building is this this decadent party venue. The split staircase that features in the movies and the Andrew Lloyd Webber rock opera, it's even better in person. It's like this catwalk for displaying this minute's fashion. The auditorium itself and the opera stage, they seem like an excuse so you can have the rest. When architect Charles Garnier showed his plans for this gaudy monstrosity to the ambitious and not always tasteful Napoleon III, the emperor asked him, "What style was this thing?" "The Napoleon III style, Your Majesty," Garnier replied. And so, of course, Garnier got the job. My only disappointments on that first trip to the Opera Garnier were that, obviously, the subterranean lake was not open to tours or even to adventurous teens sneaking where they shouldn't have been, and the chandelier, which has been surrounded since 1964 by this beautiful, tasteful, and utterly misplaced painting by Marc Chagall. To capture all this, minus the Chagall, Universal Studios brought the blueprints from Paris and reconstructed huge chunks of the actual building on their lot. The staircase, the opera box, the angel on the roof. The results are spectacular. But even the most fantastical elements are based on facts. The Opera Garnier was indeed built over that unlit subterranean cistern reachable by stone tunnels. Under its stage lay old sets and costumes, and a complex of trapdoors, which, at the time of the opera being built, were operated by some of Les Miserables who scratched out a living in Napoleon III's Paris, paid to stay literally underground and just operate the traps. The rat catcher, stupidly exaggerated by Dario Argento in his 90s slasher version, yeah, he was real. The Opera Garnier rose at the end of the broad new Boulevard de l'Opéra as part of Baron Haussmann's massive project to recreate central Paris as this glorious modern city, buying blocks upon blocks, knocking them down and rebuilding them into the Rue de Rivoli or the new and improved Champs-Élysées. A lot of people got displaced. So desperate people living literally underground in a glorious palace where the rich could patronize and sometimes exploit the socially questionable artists? Yep, that's all real. Upstairs is glorious. Downstairs are the forgotten people, and possibly even a body or two along your path down to the opera's black heart, where some guy sleeps in a coffin. For years afterwards, the most tantalizing and agonizing thing at Universal Studios in Hollywood for me was when the tour guide would point out this nondescript warehouse, Stage 28, and tell us all that inside still stood the reproduction of the Opera Garnier's auditorium, kept intact and reused in movies for decades. In my 40s, I finally had the chance to slip inside, with a friend who was working on the studio lot. The floor seating was gutted, but the opera boxes still rose up all around us. The floors were cluttered with clothing racks and a buffet for actors doing a cattle call in the midst of it all. But it was a glorious glimpse at the remains of one of my favorite films. I guess in the end, this is just a love letter to one of the greatest sets ever built, and to its original, which itself was built to be a stage for the rich to perform on their way to view a performance on yet another stage. Incidentally, when the studio was fiddling about with one of the movie's re-edits back in 1925, they scrapped the book's original redemptive anticlimactic ending in favor of this Hollywood chase scene. It's a little jarring because it takes us for the first time in the film outside the opera house itself and down the quays of the Seine on a wild carriage ride, but it has the virtue of racing past the facade of Notre Dame, left over from the equally lavish production of Hunchback of Notre Dame just a couple of years earlier. And even in this scene, we get transported back to Paris. Paris as real as it's ever gonna be.